We're very fortunate today to have two speakers who could not be better to speak on the region of the Arctic issues, particularly Alaska, but both gentlemen have broad-based knowledge of the entire Arctic. First, let me introduce David Hayes, who I'm sure is known to most of you in the room. He is, of course, currently the Deputy Secretary of the Department of the Interior, a position he's held since May 2009, and he had the good fortune, particularly in the calamitous days in Washington, to actually be confirmed by unanimous vote of the United States Senate. Not many people, I think, can say that in recent days. In his role as Deputy Secretary, he is the key leader in implementing the Secretary's priorities for the Department with a broad mandate, promoting conservation initiatives such as the President's Great Outdoors Agenda, encouraging renewable energy development on our public lands and our offshore resources, developing conventional energy resources safely and responsibly, fulfilling our trust responsibilities to the American Indians and our Alaskan Native populations, and managing our nation's water supply sustainably. I would say an agenda that few corporate CEOs probably have as wide authority. He was nominated by the President back in 2009 after serving as President Obama's transition team leader, reviewing the Department of Energy, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of the Interior, and the Environmental Protection Agency. Additionally, Secretary Hayes co-chairs the Secretary's Energy and Climate Change Task Force, and he's played an instrumental role in setting the long-standing Cobo Indian Trust litigation and is overseeing implementation of that settlement. And in his COO role, he serves on the President's Management Council and is engaged in the IT transformation and other management initiatives of a 70,000-person deployment. Mr. Hayes graduated summa cum laude from the University of Notre Dame, and he received his Juris Doctorate from Stanford University, where he was the editor of the Stanford Law Review. And he is also the former chairman of the Board of Visitors for Stanford Law School. Meade Treadwell, as I may say, my favorite elected politician. I have had the privilege of knowing for many, many years through our joint association with Wally Hickel. He was elected Alaska's Lieutenant Governor in November 2010, and he is committed to helping Governor Parnell in Alaska strengthen Alaska's economy by filling the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, facilitating a natural gas pipeline, which I hope we'll get into, bringing affordable energy to Alaskans, and standing up to the federal government when necessary to ensure access to not only the nation's natural resources, but of course Alaska's resources as well. On a national level, he has been influential in bringing about a national missile defense system and shaping U.S. Arctic policy and establishing circumpolar cooperation, clearly an issue on our agenda today. Mr. Treadwell is a graduate of Yale University and the Harvard Business School, and he brings a record of private and public sector success to his job as Lieutenant Governor. Governor Treadwell is recognized as one of the world's leading Arctic policy experts, and he was appointed to the United States Arctic Research Commission by President Bush in 2001 and designated by the President as the Commission's chair in 2006. Under his leadership, a new United States Arctic policy has been developed and adopted and is now being implemented by the current administration. It's indeed a privilege to have both gentlemen here today. Secretary Hayes, do you want to? Yes.
Should we sit here or should we go up here?
Sit, fine to sit.
Why don't we sit here, Meade? So I'll just open with a few comments. First, Charlie, thank you so much for your leadership in this area. As I mentioned to Charlie on the way over, his group of groupies here continues to grow, and appropriately so, as the small band involved in the Arctic years ago, which always included my friend Meade Treadwell, grows as it should. Let me just make a couple of opening comments, because I think the goal here is primarily to have a back and forth Q&A, and I look forward to that. The couple of points I want to make and emphasize is, first of all, the importance of the Arctic to the Obama administration. We have exhibited, I think, how important the Arctic is to our administration in a couple of different ways. First, in the international sector, this administration has been all in when it comes to the Arctic Council and participating actively and asserting a leadership role in the Arctic Council. Meade was with me in Nuuk, Greenland, when Secretary Hillary Clinton, Secretary Ken Salazar, Meade, and I, Senator Murkowski, and many others attended the ministerial meeting. That was a show of force on the behalf of the whole of government, led, of course, by our Secretary of State, the first time a Secretary of State had ever been to an Arctic Council meeting. We have another Arctic Council meeting coming up in Sweden soon. I expect a very vigorous delegation from the United States there as well. And we are looking forward to the change of guard, if you will, with our friends from Canada taking over the chairmanship soon, and the United States 2 years after that. There's been a lot of activity through the Arctic Council. It has had a long-standing, effective technical side, as you know, and what's happening is that technical side is now informing a more active policy side as well. And we are all in, as I said. The other, I think, area of illustration of the administration's commitment to the Arctic is on our domestic policy side, of course. And I point to Executive Order 13580 as an example of how serious the President is about Alaska and the Arctic. That is the executive order that set up what we call the Alaska Interagency Working Group. The President asked me to chair this group. It is a Deputy Secretary group across the government. It is focused on coordinating some of the most important issues in Alaska and in the Arctic, and they focus on energy right now. That is, energy is the economic driver in Alaska. Something like 90+% of the economy is based on energy, and of the state's revenue is. So Meade's only here because of energy. His salary depends on it. You can't get any more important than that. But in all seriousness, obviously energy is a huge issue in Alaska and in the Arctic in particular. There's been concern through the years about the balkanization of the federal role in Alaska, with so many different agencies having important roles, from NOAA to EPA to the Coast Guard to the Department of the Interior, with our land assets at the Department of the Interior as well as our ocean-based responsibilities. A tremendous challenge in coordinating all that effort. The President put an executive order together saying we're going to work at coordination across these agencies. We have done that. We have done that for specific energy enterprises. All major permits in the last 2 years have gone through the interagency process. It has led to a whole-of-government approach to energy that I think is unprecedented. Also, very briefly, as we went through this process, and the group that I chair, of deputy secretaries across the government, we found that not only were we not as coordinated as we should be as a federal government, but we also were not getting the benefit of the terrific science that is being developed in the Arctic. It was not being presented to decision makers in a way that would be useful and helpful, at least in terms of maximizing the usefulness of the science. So I teamed up with Fran Ulmer, who is also a former lieutenant governor of Alaska, who is currently the presidentially appointed chair of the Arctic Research Commission. Fran and I had a series of internal and then external discussions between scientists and policymakers involved in Alaska issues and the Arctic in particular. Very rich discussions about how best to connect those communities and take advantage of the work that is ongoing. And it has led to a collaboration that continues to this day. In fact, Fran, just a few weeks ago, announced an Arctic Science Portal that the Arctic Research Commission initiated, working with our interagency working group, to be essentially hopefully this will be a work in progress, but a way in to the current science that is available in the Arctic, organized by subject matter, user-friendly, available to everybody, all stakeholders, and certainly all policymakers and decision makers. We also discovered as we went through this process of going project by project review through the interagency process that this was not really a satisfying process when it comes to Alaska and the Arctic in particular. Not satisfying because we were being asked to make decisions on a project-by-project basis, kind of a one-off basis, without having a vision for the overall sensitivities in the Arctic, the larger questions of where development might make the most sense to occur. And our concern was that without a more holistic approach to the Arctic, without a close partnership with the state of Alaska, a close partnership with Alaska natives, and I see former Mayor Ita right here, and a close partnership with industry, with the conservation groups, et cetera, that we might make mistakes, and that we would not be executing on a vision that made economic sense, cultural sense, and environmental sense. It led us to prepare a report to the President. We brought this issue to the attention of the President about a year ago. Last summer, we kicked off an interagency effort to step back and look at this broader question. And we produced a report that's available now called Managing for the Future in a Rapidly Changing Arctic, a report to the President. This was delivered about 2 weeks ago to the President. It's available on our website. Joel Clement is here, the Director of the Interior Policy Office. Joel, where are you? I know his bag has about 20 of these things, so you can try to tackle him and get one of these precious documents. I commend it to you. It gives an overview of the change that's occurring in the Arctic, both in terms of climate change effects on the environment, which are stark and rapid. Chapter 2 provides what I think is, to my mind, the most cogent and direct discussion of the science of the changing Arctic that you will find anywhere. And then it talks also about how rapidly the Arctic is changing in terms of development issues. The oil and gas development issues, obviously, also transportation that's opened up because of the ice receding, et cetera, potential tourism. It is a rapidly changing environment. And in that context, how should we be making decisions? And the report concludes that we should be doing business differently. Along the lines, I think, of what the President suggested in the executive order, which anticipates a lot of coordination at every step of the way, working with our key partners, including the state of Alaska, including Alaska natives, and including the other interested players. Doing more scenario planning, being smarter about how we do the science, not repeating the science and not repeating our environmental analysis, but drawing on it, identifying sensitive areas, and having a broader vision and blueprint for how our economic development will proceed in the Arctic, and dealing with the big picture questions. If there needs to be a harbor, a deep water harbor in the Arctic, where should it be, and how should we make that decision? I commend the report to you. It envelops this idea in something called integrated Arctic management, and it's the way this administration now will be proceeding as we make decisions in the Arctic. Okay, I promise to be brief. I look at the clock, and somehow 12 minutes went by. So I'm going to close here, and I know Meade has some opening comments, and then I very much look forward to the dialogue.
Thank you. Good morning. I'd like to say to President Grimson, thank you for your opening remarks, and remembering this is only the second time I think I've been at Brookings, but the first time was with you and with Governor Hickel as we were trying to encourage Washington to think about Arctic policy in the early part of the century, and the Arctic policy that did come out in 2009, I believe, is an important one and a good one. And it's an honor to be here, too, with both of you on this panel. One of the things that Arctic policy talked about was shipping. And I know we're here to talk about energy, but I think what's interesting is this. In the natural resource portion of the U.S. Arctic policy, we said, let's ensure that natural resource management and economic development in the region are environmentally sustainable. Good words, fairly general. And on shipping, we got a little bit more specific. We said, let's ensure that shipping is safe, secure, and reliable. And I think the question that we struggle with here, whether it's in the energy sector or in the shipping sector, is how do we ensure that the economic development that is happening in the Arctic is reliable? Because right now the situation we're in is it's not entirely reliable. We've just gone through two major setbacks where Shell has announced a major delay in their drilling in the Outer Continental Shelf after 6 years and billions of dollars worth of expenditures. And ConocoPhillips has announced an indefinite delay based on what they say is the unreliability of a government regulatory scheme where they don't exactly know what the rules are going to be. Our situation in the north is that we have a pipeline which is declining dramatically. That Trans-Alaska pipeline, which was built at the time I was in college and is now threatening to be the world's longest chapstick. And it has the capability to produce, carry over 2 million barrels a day, and we're down to less than 600,000 and declining. It's very important for the nation, very important for the state of Alaska to see that supplies are replaced. And to do that, we need reliability. The other point about reliability is this, is that the Arctic is, whether it's in our country, whether it's in your country, whether it's in your country, Mr. Prime Minister, we are a sponge for investment right now. There are hundreds of billions of dollars that need to be invested in the Arctic for the Arctic to meet its potential, which the USGS found is potentially 13% of the world's oil, 30% of the world's gas. To move gas is a $40 to $50 billion project. To replace the oil throughput at Prudhoe Bay, right now the assessed value of the iron and steel that produces 10% of America's oil is about $18 billion. And we're going to have to quintuple that, in my opinion, in order to keep that pipeline flowing. So investors seek reliability. I see my friend Scott Borgeson was here, and he's talking about the Arctic as an emerging market. And unless we can promise reliability, we're not going to get the investment, and other countries are, and that's a challenge for the United States. Another thing, and I'm glad that you mentioned Governor Hickel, President Grimson, but a couple of things to remember about the Arctic. Right now, we are certainly going through tremendous climate change. We're also certainly going through a situation where the world is looking at Arctic resources. But I don't want us to forget that we're also going through a situation, kind of a decolonization, a devolution of power that has been happening in the last century that we should not forget and that we should finish this wave. I look at Iceland, which gained independence during the Second World War. I look at Alaska, which gained statehood, and we told the United Nations at the time that was self-determination for the Alaska people. I look at what's happening in Canada right now, where the Crown lands in Canada basically had gone to the territories, or to the provinces in the 30s and are now moving toward the territories. I look at Nunavut. I look at what's happening with home rule in Greenland. And the idea here is that if the Arctic is going to be done sustainably, you have to make sure that you keep self-determination in the forefront of your thinking. Elinor Ostrom, who we honored in Anchorage a few years ago, Mr. President, and died last year, was a winner of the Nobel Prize, a political scientist, by the way, who won in economics, for suggesting that if you're going to manage the commons, the best way is not the big Leviathan that Garrett Hardin had suggested in his essay, Tragedy of the Commons. That instead what you have to look at is 3 E's. You have to look at the environment, you have to look at the economy, and you have to look at equity. In the Arctic, we're still looking for equity with revenue sharing. There's revenue sharing in the Gulf, but not revenue sharing in the Arctic part of the United States. And when we look at the environment, and believe me, as an Alaskan, I was Deputy Commissioner of Environment. I helped set up an environmental crimes unit. I'm a zealot against oil spills, and Julie Gorley, who's here just back from the North Pole, can certainly attest to that our arguments the state of Alaska with the federal government right now on shipping are that we need to do more to protect the environment. But we also need to do more to ensure reliability because we're out there trying to attract investment. Of 16 interagency groups right now that were spawned by that Arctic policy, including your interagency working group, we're happy to see the activity in Washington to look at the North. But the state of Alaska is not included in that. A very good conclusion of this report, by the way, was that the state should be included more. We're actually quite excited about that and looking forward to seeing the terms of reference. But we have a situation where there's a shipping report out right now, a CMTS report, where the state did not get to see the draft ahead of time. And yet, I'd say if you're going to build an Arctic port, it's going to be with our money as well as federal money. It's going to be with our people. We should be there at the table. There's a new National Security Council led Arctic strategy effort where the state has again been invited to comment. But it's very important that the state be involved there, sitting at the table. We are not just a stakeholder, we're a sovereign partner. And that's a point that we constantly need to make again. Here in Washington, there are no built incentives for the bureaucracy to succeed. And as such, in our state, we've got people who are going to be out of work if we don't succeed. We have a state that is very dependent on natural resource development, and it's not that we're dependent employment-wise solely on oil and gas. We also have a major fishing industry, a major employer. We want to protect that. We have a major transportation industry and aviation, and we hope it will grow in shipping. We want to be known not just for the resources beneath our feet, but for the resources between our ears. I think Alaskans have a lot to contribute and value added around the world. But the fact is that we need reliability, and we don't have a reliable policy that encourages investment in the oil patch in the Arctic coming out of Washington. And we are very, very hopeful that we can see that. Let me just conclude, Charlie, by saying that I chair the Alaska Historical Commission, and we've got several anniversaries coming up that I think are important to recognize. It is 25 years ago next month that we opened the border between Alaska and Russia. That melting of the ice curtain was very significant. And I want to compliment the Department of Interior, Mr. Secretary, for one project that has really kept the door open for some time, and that's been the Beringia project. We had concern that the recent announcement on Beringia did not take the economic development goals of the region into consideration, and we look forward to working with you on economic development goals in the Bering area. But that 25-year anniversary should be marked because it's very, very important that we take advantage of the end of the Cold War still and build trade and success in this area. It's amazing that after 25 years, the trade between Alaska and Russia is still just about $10 million a year. It could be much, much more. A second anniversary coming up in 2017 is we come up on the 150th anniversary of the Alaska Purchase. Now, I've heard some Russians say, well, why should we celebrate that? And I've heard some Alaska Natives say, well, why should we celebrate that? And I guess I'll say this. I believe that here in the United States, becoming an Arctic nation, that is something to celebrate. And I believe the welfare of Alaska Natives compared to that of indigenous communities around the world is good, solid, and there's great hope and great potential because of what we have on American soil. But we do still have this debate here in Washington. Was the purchase of Alaska Sewards Folly? Was it Seward's Icebox? Was it Wall Russia? Or was it a sucked orange? Did we buy something that the Russians had already taken all the best out of? I don't think so. We Alaskans are still trying to help America get a good return on its investment. Thank you.
Thank you both, gentlemen. Meade, I believe it was you who made reference that Conoco says, they're hesitating to proceed until there's regulatory certainty. What, from the vantage point, really, of both of you, from both the federal government's jurisdiction and the state's interests in jurisdiction, what do you think a firm like Conoco means when they say there's regulatory uncertainty, and how could we move to give regulatory certainty?
happy to take a first crack at that. We met, of course, with Ryan Lance, the CEO of ConocoPhillips, about a week ago, shortly before their announcement. And I think I should step back for a minute to answer this question in the context of our experience with Shell Oil Company in terms of the offshore exploration activities that occurred last summer. As you know, we went forward working closely with Shell, who's been a very good partner, in providing an opportunity for them to do exploratory drilling in the Chukchi and in the Beaufort Sea last summer. We identified some Arctic-specific expectations and requirements in collaboration with Shell. These were mutually agreed upon. And they involved some important features that relate to the special challenges of offshore Arctic exploration. We asked Shell to provide a capping stack, just as is required for exploratory activities in the Gulf of Mexico, in case there is a loss of well control, so you can kill the well through a capping stack. We wanted the availability of a relief well, which we also have in our offshore capabilities in the Gulf of Mexico. And we asked for the ability to have on scene a ship that could contain a spill, that could, if there was a spill, the ability to capture it and put it in a barge, essentially. Those are all requirements that now everyone that's doing deep water exploration in the Gulf is required to do. And industry has come to the fore, working together in two major consortiums, and they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars to have these capabilities, which have all grown out of the experience of the Macondo well. In the Alaska offshore, we have some situations, some helpful situations in terms of it's shallower water. The pressures are known in these reservoirs, so there is somewhat less risk there. On the other hand, if there is a spill, if there is a loss of well control, and we have a Macondo well type of situation, we don't have the infrastructure in Alaska. And that's why we had the capping stack and the containment requirement for Shell. Shell worked very hard to get ready for one other special thing about the Arctic is the ice comes in quickly at the end of October, early November. And so we needed to work with Shell to have a window for the drilling that made sense from the ice formation perspective, and we worked with them on that. There were some issues with Shell's ability to deal with these issues, and we did a report about 3 weeks ago that chronicled those issues. My sense from the ConocoPhillips side is that they understand that, and we've been very clear, we expect all drillers in the Arctic to have a capping stack and containment capability to respect the ice needs, et cetera. I think that they will be willing to do that. There is some question about whether Shell will be ready for next summer or not. I think ConocoPhillips will want to be there potentially in theater with Shell and not without Shell, because that provides the kind of mutual aid opportunities that could provide economic benefits to both companies. So I think the bottom line is, number one, there really is not much of a question about what the expectations are for folks drilling in the Arctic. We've laid it out with Shell. We've told the rest of the industry these are the expectations. They're common sense expectations. Number two, we learned through last summer that it's hard to pull this off in the Arctic. A lot of the issues were not, of course, dealing with the drilling, but with marine transportation issues. The tough seas and the challenges of getting up there. It's just a reminder that this is tough. We are very hopeful that ConocoPhillips and Shell will both remain committed to the Arctic. They certainly have a big investment in the Arctic. We're committed to work with them to help them be successful.
Well, when I brought up reliability, I met with the ConocoPhillips people earlier this week before coming down here, and they had a lot of questions about what the federal requirements really are and where they are in the regulations, what the process is that will result from your report. And I think that's a big challenge for us. I mean, this is happening, and I have to say this. The whole of government approach, I certainly support in principle. And we've gone through this with ocean policy. We're now going through this with integrated Arctic management. People argue that we shouldn't have stovepipes, okay? But I honestly don't want the fish people in charge of the oil development. And I don't think you do either. And the fact is that we made a decision to lease these areas. We invited explorers in. We asked them to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, if not billions of dollars. And now the rules aren't clear. And I think we have to make the rules clearer faster.
If I can just respond, I think the rules that apply to Shell are clear as a bell. They're in the exploration plan that Shell adopted and in the related documentation. Clear as a bell in terms of the window for exploration, the expectations of what is available in terms of oil spill response, including capping, stack, and containment. They were clear as a bell months and months and months and months before the drilling season. They're clear as a bell for any, and Shell is the only first company in the door. So they're clear for Shell. We're telling ConocoPhillips we're going to expect everybody who wants to explore in the offshore to meet equivalent requirements. You make a good point. We hope that there will be other companies coming in and that we don't proceed on a case-by-case basis. And we are looking at certainly incorporating these requirements and making it clear that everyone doing business up there should meet these requirements. Right. I don't think there's lack of clarity. I do think there is a recognition in the community, and I would guess you would agree with this, Meade, that Shell had encountered challenges they didn't expect, and found that a variety of circumstances were conspiring, it seemed like, against their success last summer. And it was unfortunate, but there it was. I think ConocoPhillips also, everyone who wants to do exploration 80 miles off of Wainwright in the Western Arctic has got to, with very limited shoreside support, is going to face real challenging logistical considerations. I'm impressed that how Shell handled the situation, and I would expect, and I hope that the American oil companies, and I'll put Shell in that category here for purposes of today, but the large, responsible multinationals, it is good that they are learning, that they are adhering to sensible requirements, because we're talking about an international situation here. There's going to be oil drilling in Russia. There has been and will be more exploration in Greenland. Norway obviously has a huge oil and gas operation. There's a bigger stake here in terms of protecting the environment and providing a good climate for clarity for oil and gas development. I think that because of the experiences we've been having last year, and as we continue to develop, working closely with the companies, Shell and Conoco in particular, Statoil to follow, that we are setting together a menu of expectations that can provide the blueprint for what other companies should do or what other countries should expect of their companies throughout the Arctic.
That really leads on to my follow-on question, which you may feel you've answered. But a lot of times we hear, particularly in the environmental community, concerns that one of the challenges regarding Arctic energy development is this whole issue of regulatory arbitrage. Companies operating to different standards perhaps in different countries, and of course I think the greatest concern is probably Russia. Do you think this is a legitimate concern? And if you do you have any suggestions for methods we might use to ensure best practice across jurisdictions rather than have the classic race to the bottom when it comes to standards?
You want to start, and then I'll comment.
I'll start out by saying the issue of regulatory arbitrage assumes that all regulation is on a continuum where there's something that's tough and something that's not tough, okay? And there's more than one way to skin a cat. I've heard arguments about jack-up rigs versus floating rigs. And there are many different ways also to contain, control, clean up oil. So there's not exactly always one way to do it, right? The idea, though, is that we want to get the energy out safely. We want to get the energy out. And nations will have best practices or good practices, and we try very hard to have them adopt this together. When I was at the Arctic Research Commission, we did everything we could to encourage the joint industry program that's happening right now. It's led by SINTEF in Norway. I think the last round of funding was something like $21 million to get common practices and improved practices on oil and ice response, for example. And I can't see anybody in today's global investment environment where, you know, I mean, ever since Amoco Cadiz was sued for a spill in France in a Chicago court, basically you need to have good standards and global investment to make that happen. The other thing I'll say, though, is that we have to be very, very careful when we create regulation that you're not also creating undue barriers to entry. There are big prospects in the Arctic and small prospects in the Arctic. And I have seen big companies, I can go back to when I was running an air program for the state of Alaska, who come in and say, let's have all these requirements. And it's great for them, but for the little guy, it's pretty hard to get into the door. And the situation, even between Shell and ConocoPhillips, is it's two different sized investments for two different prospects. And if two companies can't say, hey, we're going to go about this in a different way, you've got a problem.
I'll make a couple of points, Charlie. I think it's extraordinarily important that best practices be shared internationally and that there be an ongoing international dialogue among regulators, environmental ministers, energy ministers, and companies interested in doing business in the Arctic. That has begun. After the Macondo well situation, Secretary Salazar called the energy and environmental ministers of the major deep water drilling countries together for a meeting in Washington to talk about and share information. There's something called the International Regulators Forum that provides a forum for the regulators to get together. Last year, Norway sponsored in Trondheim a similar meeting with industry, with major energy and environmental ministers that the Secretary and I participated in. Canada has offered to host it later this year. This is extremely important. I do not think that one size fits all when it comes to how you ensure that there's safe offshore oil and gas development in the Arctic. There's a large debate that I think largely misses the point to some extent, but between the safety case approach that is more typical in the EU and the regulatory, what is often sort of derisively called a prescriptive approach, that is the typical U.S. approach when it comes to regulating environmentally sensitive activities. The reality is we need a hybrid. You have to have a safety case approach. You have to have management systems in place that put responsibility on the companies to ensure that their operations are excellent and that they have the systems that will ensure compliance, and you're not doing a checklist kind of approach. In fact, just last week, the Obama administration put out its second phase of new requirements for industry to do safety management systems. Our first one came out about a year ago, September. Companies are now incorporating safety case concepts into U.S. operations, which is very positive. On the other hand, there can be some basic requirements that we expect oil and gas companies in the offshore to meet. You can call them prescriptive, but we think they should have access to a capping stack. We think they should have access to containment systems, by way of example. We think they may have to pay attention to what our NOAA forecasters believe is when the ice is going to come in, they may have to get off. So there can be some bright line prescriptive type requirements that we insist on, consistent with a safety case And they should be performance standards. And the containment requirement, for example, as we've talked to ConocoPhillips about, doesn't have to be the Arctic Challenger, which is the ship that the Shell put together to meet its containment. What we want is the companies to figure out how they meet a performance standard to be able to capture the oil if there is a loss of well control. So it's really a hybrid, and I think once you get into these forums where you have the environment and energy ministers of the countries that are sophisticated in offshore development, and you have the companies, you get beyond this sort of philosophical safety case versus prescriptive stuff, and you get down to brass tacks and figure out what are the best practices, and each country should figure out how they will incorporate those best practices. That's what we're trying to do, and we're trying to share the experience we're having with the other Arctic nations, and I think that's what we're going to want to do, continue to do going forward.
And just for details, besides the international processes, you mentioned, I think we're looking forward to the next chairmanship of the Arctic Council, where there's likely to be more exchange of best practices in this area, and that's going to be helpful. But I will say this: the ConocoPhillips guys, and believe me, I have seen companies cut out of town and say we're not going to be there because of tough environmental regulations or uncertainty. That has happened before. I don't believe that was ConocoPhillips doing this for some other reason. I think they still don't feel that there's clarity there to know what the rules are. We'd like to see that happen. And I think the other question that Alaskans don't yet see is as we go between the state of Alaska and make this trip to Washington, it's hard to believe that Washington cares about getting that pipeline full. And the plan's not working if there is a plan. Okay, and that's what we've got to figure out, is how to make it work and how to have confidence that it will work. And there are lots of decisions being made. We just reduced taxes by an incredible amount to try to bring investors to the table in the state of Alaska. And our next job, the governor's going on the road, our commissioners on the road, is to go out and try to attract investment. And we'd really like to have you with us, showing that there is a clear regulatory path to be able to get the money in and to get the projects done.
We are, if I can, Charlie, I always enjoy talking with Meade, listening to Meade and having a good exchange. Whether we're on a cargo plane off putting buoys out in the Chukchi or whatever, right?
You or I could have thrown either one of us overboard.
Yeah.
Okay, sure.
I was hooked in pretty carefully, actually. The Alaska pipeline, keeping the pipeline going is extremely important. There's no doubt about that. There's shared responsibility to make that happen. I won't go into it, but right now, and the governor's been clear about this, there are tax disincentives for companies to continue to produce on those wonderful long-standing oil fields in the Prudhoe Bay area. And if with the right...
My guess is he'll sign the bill soon.
Oh, that would be great, because that in the near term is the way to continue that pipeline. What's the federal role here? The federal role is the NPRA, National Petroleum Reserve Alaska. Through our interagency group, we busted the sort of permitting stalemate that preceded our coming into office and approved the first land-based development that ConocoPhillips will be developing in CD5. Ryan Lance said, and Trond Eric just said, they're going to be constructing, I believe, next winter. And moving forward with that. We have a new management plan for the NPRA that makes it clear that the solution we have there for going over the Colville River is a solution that other oil companies should be able to utilize. We hope that will trigger additional investment in the NPRA. And when it comes to the offshore, I really don't want to get into a back and forth about what ConocoPhillips told us versus what they told you. I just go back to the point that it was a rough summer last summer for Shell Oil Company and for anyone looking at investing in the Arctic. And it just renewed the point that everyone's got to be cautious, go in this with their eyes open and clarity. We had a very good discussion with ConocoPhillips about our expectations, their expectations. We're going to continue to talk with them. We don't think it's going to be a regulatory uncertainty issue that will affect ConocoPhillips going forward, and it's our intent that it not be.
Good.
Could I move on, and then we'll go to the floor? The one area I know is in both your gentlemen's interests, and that is the whole subject of how do we accelerate the development of Alaskan natural gas. We all know we have this vast resource sitting up at Prudhoe Bay and probably gas elsewhere in the state, and yet after all these years we're no closer, despite many people's efforts, both at the federal government and the state government, to make this a reality. I know the advent of shale gas in the lower 48 hasn't made that any easier, since clearly most people would say there's probably no market for Alaskan gas in the lower 48 for the foreseeable future. So how do we get this resource developed? How do we get it to some of our vital allies in the Far East that desperately need this gas, particularly our Japanese friends in the wake of Fukushima? I'd like to hear your prospects on that.
Well, thank you. This has been an interesting year on natural gas. Norway made its first shipments of LNG across the Arctic Ocean through the Bering Strait to markets in East Asia. The geopolitical fact is that with the accessible Arctic Ocean, sources in Northern Europe can now look at Asia as a market. Some of these sources were looking at North America, and the shale gas situation has basically taken away the North American market. And Alaska is again looking very hard at the Asian market. Our governor made a visit to Japan and Korea last year. Our commissioner of natural resources is right now down with about 6,000 people in the LNG business in Houston. I talked to him yesterday. And we are very much on the market trying to get interest on buyers to make a project happen. The three North Slope producers who have never together said we're going to pursue LNG said that last year and came up with a rough project definition earlier this year. And we're looking for a field season where we will see a better project definition later on this year. In the meantime, the state of Alaska has just passed a bill, which the governor hasn't signed yet, but he supported, which will allow the state to invest and play in either a large project or to go ahead and build its own smaller 36-inch to 42-inch project that would bring gas, make gas available to Alaskans. And that also needs an export market to move forward. One way or another, I've always said that if you're going to have a gas pipeline, you need buyers and sellers to get together. And the fact is buyers and sellers are now talking. There may be ways to improve that. The Washington climate is not really a regulatory problem here. We've given rights of ways now to 4 or 5 gas pipelines, so I don't think that's as much of a problem. But there is still some uncertainty as whether the United States recognizes that it's in our interest to be an energy exporter. Since there's not much of a market for Alaska gas in the lower 48, I don't think we'll have a problem getting that, but that's the place where we're looking for clarity out of Washington. And frankly, if Washington can make the point with our Asian potential customers that we are a good long-term reliable source, that'll be helpful. I want to make one other point, which is there are days at Prudhoe Bay when the operators are saying to certain wells, choke back oil production from that well because too much gas comes out of that particular hole. And until we have a way to ship gas out of Prudhoe Bay, it is a restriction on more oil production. So this is very important for the country, not just to monetize the gas that's there, and there are people in this room who've worked long and hard on that issue, but also to get more oil development going. So we're excited about the prospects of Point Thompson, excited about the big approach and the small approach and the producers coming together.
I think Mead put it very well. The Obama administration has been supportive from the beginning of development of the natural gas resource in Alaska, which is amazing in terms of the size of the resource. And of course, the world market has changed in the last 4 years. And the assumption had been And we have legislation on the books to facilitate a pipeline coming all the way down to the lower 48. And with the price of gas and the new discoveries and capabilities in the lower 48, that doesn't look economically feasible anymore. And the state has really led an effort to evaluate a different approach that would provide export to Asia. And we're standing by and very interested in how this might develop.
Just one final question on pipelines, and then we'll go to the audience. There's been some talk that were the Keystone pipeline not to be approved by the President and the administration, that one option potentially for some of the unconventional Canadian oil production might be to come up through British Columbia and link into TAP. Do you see any TAPs? Do you see any prospect of that really becoming a reality?
Well, you know, we've always looked for ways to integrate our transportation system better with the lower 48, and if the Canadians want to bring a pipeline up to TAPS, we'd welcome that. On the other hand, I have always hoped that Washington could get through its several pipeline problems, and the Keystone is one of them. So, David, I don't know what your
It's above my pay grade. Stay tuned.
Said like a diplomat. All right, let's go to the floor, please. Again, please state your name and institutional affiliation if you have one. Yes, sir, there. There are mics coming.
Brooks Yeager with the Heinz Center on Science and Economics and the Environment. I wanted to congratulate David Hayes and Joel Clement in the Interior Department on the report that was made to the President on planning future Alaska, and particularly on the transparency of the process that led to that report. Governor Treadwell, you mentioned a different report which doesn't seem to be as transparent in the offing, and that is a work going on right now on an Arctic strategy to complement the Arctic policy of the U.S., apparently being led by the National Security Council. But beyond that, many of us don't know very much about what is in this report or who's been talked to. I'm glad to hear that the state of Alaska has been asked for comment. I was curious, Secretary Hayes, if you could give us a little enlightenment on the status of the Arctic strategy effort and whether or not, as some of us have heard, it's actually going to be completed prior to May when the ministerially the Arctic Council was made, which would seem to be verging on threatening to be a quite superficial and perhaps mistaken course of action. Thanks.
Nice to hear from you, Brooks. Brooks is a former head of the policy office of the Department of the Interior, as many of you know, and a good friend. The National Security Council is developing an Arctic strategy document. It has been going through an interagency process. I think it'll be a good document. The timing remains in flux. We were pleased to put the report out to the President to help, I think, inform that process. And in fact, I was working with the National Security Council all through the fall as we worked on the report to the President to ensure an understanding of some of the unique features of Alaska and the Arctic. And in particular, I think traditionally there has not been a sensitivity to how important the issues of Alaska Natives are, of the subsistence needs and expectations of local residents, and the fast changing nature of the Arctic. All of this has been fed into this National Security Council effort in I think a very excellent way in terms from where I sit of the internal government process. I can't speak to, I don't know what the National Security Council has done completely in terms of outreach. But I will say this, that any strategy document is always a starting point for additional building blocks, and it's impressive to me that the Obama administration has taken this up again. It was at the very end of the Bush administration that the Arctic policy document came out. In the final throes, here we are right at the beginning of the second term, and we are coming out with a comprehensive approach on how to deal with integrated Arctic management. I hope we'll have the National Security Council speaking to the Arctic and reinforcing the point that has really not yet sunk in many sectors here, that we are an Arctic nation, that the Arctic is incredibly important to the United States' interests and to the globe, and that what happens up there needs to happen in the right way for purposes of that fragile environment, for purposes of making sure the economic opportunities are realized but in the right way, and to ensure, most of all, I would say, that the Edward Idas of the world who live in the Arctic and who have for centuries relied on that ebb and flow of whales, of caribou, of that special ecosystem, that their culture and their rights remain intact.
I appreciate the call for transparency. David, you have this group and you have a liaison from the state of Alaska who doesn't get to come to all the meetings. On this group here doing the Arctic transportation study that was called for by Congress, there was a little consultation. We never got to see the draft before it came out. There's two giant things missing in that draft in terms of an understanding of America's role in shipping. We've got in the state of Alaska, we just finished a Northern Waters Task Force. We have an Arctic Policy Commission meeting now. We look forward to greater consultation ahead of this time, because commenting on a report at the end doesn't help if big pieces of the structure are missing. And that's a real problem. The United States keeps kicking the can on safe shipping in the North when it comes to getting contingency planning in place. You have it with Shell, but you don't have it with the ships going by. And we keep making that point, and we don't see it show up in any of these documents. We could write a whole chapter on it. We've offered to write a whole chapter on it. It's not there. We're hopeful with the National Security Council process that because it is a strategy called for by our delegation, that it basically has a strategy to come together and provide the clarity that we need to bring the investment that we need and to move forward, because the opportunities in the Arctic are tremendous.
Another question over here against the wall?
Thank you. My name is Richard Ranger. I'm with the American Petroleum Institute. In different ways, Secretary Hayes, Lieutenant Governor Treadwell, and Prime Minister Kleist have spoken about the role of the indigenous peoples in Alaska in decision-making, both regionally and governmentally. Lieutenant Governor Treadwell, you used the term, we're seeing a process of devolution, and you spoke of it later in the context of Alaska's sovereignty. But clearly, there are rising expectations and there are changing modes of decision-making with respect to the role of the indigenous peoples who live in the Arctic. What's the vision and where is that going? Because I think that's one area where operators in my industry may be seeing some uncertainties. There has been a playbook. There's a belief that that playbook may be changing, again, regionally and with respect to U.S. federal interests in the Arctic regarding the role to be played by the peoples who live there. I guess comment on your visions and where you see this going.
Good question. By the way, I didn't comment on, I didn't know if Meade meant that Alaska was going to move for secession or not, the devolution, but I hope not. I hope not. And by the way, it was a really good deal with Russia, and we should celebrate that. We have a special responsibility to Alaska Natives. We have 250 some odd individual tribes in Alaska that we have a trust responsibility for. and how that plays out in terms of impact on decision making is essentially a special obligation to consult with tribes, to work closely with tribes, but also all residents of the unique towns on the North Slope, by way of example. These are the folks that are most impacted by what happens in the Arctic. And many of them exercise a subsistence culture that relies very strongly on their ability to hunt whales, which can affect and has affected our view with Shell of when they could drill in the Beaufort so as not to interfere with the whale hunt. Likewise, if there is a pipeline coming in at Wainwright and going across, obviously the interests of the health of the caribou herds and other animals that are relied upon. There's no sort of, I think you know this, there's no easy, quick answer that in terms of the input of any community. I would just say, as we've emphasized in the report to the President, that there is a special obligation that we have to get the input up front for Indigenous Alaskans. And I will say that one of the things we talk about here, one of the things we're trying to do in the interagency group is, you know, it can be hard for industry to deal with the federal government, hard for the state of Alaska to deal with the federal government, but if you are an Alaska Native in Wainwright, and you want to provide input to the Coast Guard and to the Navy and to the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and NOAA on important issues, it's been very hard to do that. And it's not easy to get a plane ticket to Anchorage, et cetera. We're trying to actually do way better on that. We collected all of the federal agencies in early February for the Alaska Whaling Commission meetings up in Barrow, and we arrayed everyone across the table and said, we want to talk to you on all of our subjects and answer all of your questions. We need to do much more of that. And I think it's that level of commitment and that will be shown by performance that we need to be held to, and companies, let me say, Shell, ConocoPhillips have been good about investing in these relationships as well. They get it as well, and I'm very cheered by that. I don't think there is any dispute about the importance of that. The state of Alaska also is very much committed to that course of action.
Richard, just to add very quickly, I want to compliment former mayor Ita of the North Slope Borough. He began a process which is continued under his successor, and we also work with the mayors of the other boroughs to make sure that we have regular consultation. Edward, there was a meeting that you held in Barrow that I thought was remarkable, and that you brought in your village leaders, and we talked about energy development and state policy, and we've tried very hard to keep that consultation up. On the tribal level, we've seen tremendous gains in capacity, whether it's in health, whether it's in cooperation in sanitation, whether it's in cooperation on other issues, and there's always more that can be done, and I think more will be done. I'm not going to steal any of Jimmy Stott's thunder, but we were in Nome last week at the Coeric 40th anniversary. He made the point that the standard by which all development projects in the North should be judged is food security, and I agree with him personally. Our governor said on a big mine prospect in Alaska, we're not going to replace one resource with another. And the fact is that the respect that I think all Arctic residents are looking for is that kind of consultation and understanding. That's why we're pushing for contingency planning with ships going by. That's why we're pushing for certainty in regulation so that we can all see what the picture is.
I know Secretary Hayes has to be at the White House shortly, so maybe we'll take one more question for this session. Lady here.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Folks, and I manage Google's Ocean program. And my question is around when will the U.S. government increase its funding for infrastructure? So part of the problem oil and gas has off the coast of Alaska is they don't have good enough satellite wind data, ice extent data, like comms, Arctic comms is really challenged. Like it's a very difficult condition, and if the Coast Guard's funding has been cut, like when will we increase the Coast Guard's funding so they have more icebreakers, so that we have greater safety and security for mariners, so that Alaskans can make sure that they avoid what happened in the Gulf with the Deep Horizon? Thank you.
The president's budget that was introduced and made public, a week ago or so, has good budgeting for Alaska-related issues. Unfortunately, in amounts that are not well correlated to what the Congress has authorized for the many agencies involved in Alaska. It's a very important point, and I think that funding's always going to be hard for these activities. I am cheered by several quick points. One is the attention that we are all collectively giving to this important area of the world. And funding can follow if there's a shared understanding of the importance of the Arctic. And I want to thank all of you in your own way for helping raise the profile of the Arctic, because funding can follow. Secondly, I think the national security strategy document that is underway has the potential to be very helpful in raising the profile of the importance of some of these infrastructure issues. And thirdly, I agree with Meade. The reality is that I think that for funding major infrastructure going forward, it's got to be a collaboration between the federal government, the state government, and private parties. And we've got to find a new way to work together. And having a blueprint of integrated Arctic management for what's needed, and working truly in partnership with the residents of the area, with the state, and with the major private players. That's what we have to do. We have not done that yet in this country in a meaningful way. We have the chance to do it in the Arctic, and I commend all of you to work with us collectively toward that end.
We are putting up money where we can as a state. It's been the state that's put up significant money for the automatic identification systems to make sure we know what boats are coming by. We are putting up the money. There's money in the capital budget this year to continue the port study. We've got another couple $100,000 looking at the role of the Aleutian ports. We have provided leasing for the Coast Guard to move their helicopters north. Our National Guard and the Coast Guard are working very much together on that. And we agree with you. In fact, the state of Alaska has even said we would consider working with the Coast Guard on financing icebreakers. It's very, very important that, this is half the nation's coastline. And I've had senior Coast Guard admirals say, well, I'm not sure we can afford Alaska. And my answer is, I'm not sure we can afford California. I mean, the fact is that this is a sovereign part of our country that we have to protect, and we have to stand up for it. The Bush policy was held up for 6 or 8 months over two, I like to say, food fights, but one of them was whether or not we could say anything about the need for icebreakers. And let me say it here because it's very hard for a federal official to say it. The state of Alaska believes we got to have icebreakers. And there's a dozen reasons. I'll give you why.
I'm for icebreakers too. But you can't quote me on that, no. Can I close with one illustration that provides hope for the future along these lines? It is ridiculous, but we do not have good mapping capability for the topography of Alaska. And the state of Alaska came to us and said, we got to fix this problem. And we collaborated together. The state threw in some money. We at the Interior Department sponsored an across the government effort that ultimately has been a tin cup effort to find funding from a lot of different sources. We're going to get that done. And the reason we're getting it done is because we're working together collaboratively. We see the need, and we're working across our governments to make it happen. That's in a small scale what we need to do. And you put the state
at the table at the beginning.
Absolutely.
We showed up with resources,
Absolutely.
And we're there at every meeting.
Absolutely.
I need you to work on EPA for me, but that's a different story.
Okay.
I want to thank Secretary Hayes and Governor Treadwell for a very charming and enlivening discussion, which I expected.